The original design for the walkers came from a piece of artwork that Sid Mead had done. That was an ad for a big corporation.
Joe talked to him about basing his design on Sid Mead's work, and Sid was fine with that. It wasn't a direct copy, it was just inspiration.
I saw some of the early designs for it, and originally it was always the 4 legs, but it didn't originally have the head on it, and the legs were farther apart, and it just was kind of this bulky sort of thing. And at some point in there, it became more dog-like, and so you could relate to it subconsciously. It sort of had a head, which is where the control guys kind of were, which makes no sense. Why weren't they in the actual thing? It didn't have a tail. They couldn't figure out how to give it a tail on it. But it had the 4 legs that were put together, tighter so the hips weren't as wide apart. And you could really recognize it then and kind of relate to it. And it was just a great design. We made a number of them about this big, this tall, like that just big enough for the hands of the animator to hold the legs and the forearms back and the head to be able to animate it. And then we made a bigger one, probably 4 feet tall, for a few shots when it has to collapse.
And they had electric clutches in the joints so they could trigger the legs to collapse on cue. Well, the thing got to be so heavy, and I had built the body for it, and it was pretty heavy. The electric clutches just wouldn't hold up and fire on cue. So we ended up hanging the guy from a rope, released a rope and pulled him down with the smaller cable. He had little explosions going on throughout the body work, and it just looked great. It had tremendous mass. The way it fell, you believed it was 100 tons.
All right, stand by, Dak.
Well, the rebels used the speeder to take down the snow walkers, the giant AT-ATs. And what they would do is fly around the legs, ejecting a cable so they could tie up the legs and trip the walkers. So we built several. One was a pyro model that would crash into the snow and blow up. It was a very small model, maybe a foot long. And to make it look like a 20-foot-long aircraft was a real trick. And my role was to animate the air brakes, the flaps on the back. As the animated flaps would move, of course, the ship would bank and turn. We animated the pilots so they would, look around, look where they're flying. The day we did the pyro shot, it was on the old D building on Kerner. Well, it was such an impressive shot. After doing a few tests, everybody knew this was going to be spectacular. The entire company was on a balcony overlooking the stage, and our manager came in and looked around and said, "Oh my God, this is costing me $1,000 a minute. I have all these people watching." I mean, there was literally nobody working. Everybody was waiting for that shot. It was hysterical.
The Tauntauns and the Walkers were the two first things that got the stop motion department up and running on Empire, making replicas of things that you could not produce any other way, and making articulated models of strange creatures, putting them in photographic backgrounds and trying as hard as you could to make it appear as though those performances that were shot one frame at a time had the same mass and weight and lighting effects as the photographic backgrounds that your live characters are in. George wanted to see some designs for this creature that was essentially a horse, and I think it was characterized as a snow lizard. So I just did a whole bunch of 8 or 10 drawings, and then I did like a little clay maquette of one of the drawings with a little rider on the back of it, which was my best guess. We brought that up to George, and he said, well, this looks like a good one. And that was the idea. It was just a thing that got people from A to B that just helped kind of flesh out the reality of the snow landscape of Hoth. If you have a shot that requires the tauntaun to take a breath, fall down, do a death rattle, and a final breath, each of these moments are like you just scale them. So it's like a 4-second shot. And something like that could easily take, 6 to 8 hours to shoot, because you got to make sure that you're trying to register everything very carefully, and you can't kick any of the lights. If you kick any of the lights, then you have to start the shot over. And so you just go through it one frame at a time, and they're literally sculpting in space and time. There were only a couple of tauntaun shots, I think, that we did multiple takes on. And most of that was because I was just pleading with George and Dennis, come on, let me do another take. Please, 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 let me just do one more. And they go, okay, fine, but only one more.
Up until the Rebel transport, most of the ships that we'd done had a lot of flat surfaces. They were concerned that a curved surface would be difficult to photograph on a blue screen because of blue spill. The flat surface ships turned out to be maybe a little overly conservative, and as long as the surface of the ship was matte, the blue spill didn't really turn out to be much of a problem regardless of the shape. It was also influenced by some of the curving, more organic ships and artwork by Mobius around that time, John Giroux. And it was a little bit of an homage to his kind of sense of humor, making a big spaceship look like a clam. When you live with a model for months and think about it and imagine it in so many different ways, it's almost always disappointing to see it on screen, because in your imagination it lives 360 degrees from a lot of different views, and you imagine it in different lighting. And the most enjoyable thing is just to become engrossed in creating something rather than just piling on irrelevant details. That model had so much detail, particularly on the underside of it with all the containers and things that don't really show up on the screen. If they have lots and lots of detail that are not random and not repetitious, that have little pieces that are meaningful, as soon as you see something like that and you identify it in your mind, then it gives you a feeling of scale.
I am wondering, why are you here?
I'm looking for someone.
Looking? Found someone you have, I would say.
Right.
One of the earlier things I did is I got Joe Johnston to work on Yoda to try to figure out, what he would look like so it'd be easier to write him. That really comes from a tradition in mythological storytelling, fairy tales, of the hero finding a little creature on the side of the road that seems very insignificant and not very important, who comes out to be the master wizard, the master thing, or the guide, the main guide in the movie for the hero. And so I wanted him to be a little insignificant character, somebody that, like a frog or something that you just didn't pay any attention to. And he turns out to be the most powerful Jedi in the universe. And so that was why he started out being very small and green. And then we wanted to make him attractive but strange. And so he's actually got proportions very much like a baby, and with giant ears.
Frank Oz and his associates have come up with different heads. None of them work. So Stuart Freeborn, the makeup expert, he said, "Can you give me a week? I'll give you the head of Yoda."
He showed me a few drawings and things he had with him, and I looked at them. And I thought, well, that's interesting there and there, but I want something in more depth. I looked in the mirror, and I thought, well, something perhaps a little bit amusing about my face. At least I could get that in. So I modelled something of myself. And I thought, now I've got to make him look intelligent. And I got this photograph of Einstein, and on top of what I'd roughly done of myself, I then put the Einstein wrinkles in all around.
And here was his head. And I looked at him, and I looked at Yoda, and I realized what everybody was realizing and couldn't say. It was a self-portrait of Stuart Freeborn.
I'm not afraid.
You will be. You will be.
Sorry. No problems.
In the original of the Star Destroyer, Ralph McQuarrie was the one that did this little triangular thing, maybe about 1.5 inches long, that was in one drawing, incidentally. And George really liked that idea. And then he hired a model maker. This was before there ever was an ILM, that they made these concept models. Ours became more swarthy, more aggressive looking kind of a ship, as opposed to this more delicate kind of space station-y looking ship.
We see the White Star Destroyer in the beginning of Episode 4, and then in Episode 5 we see the big White Star Destroyer again when the rebels escape from Hoth and the Empire is in pursuit of them. You know, it was really fun to build because it was a larger version of the 3-foot Star Destroyer, so a lot of the uncertainties about what it was, like the proportions of it and the shape and all that stuff, was pretty well nailed down.
One of the things that was very important was to try and transmit to people what the scale of the thing really was, how big it was. And we knew that the way that when you fly over a city, you tell the difference between flying over Poughkeepsie, Illinois and Los Angeles is by how many lights there are. And so that's what we had, our guide was, and we put tens of thousands of fiber optics in that particular ship. And fiber optics allow you to have this little tiny little pinpoint of light. We had a light source on the inside of it, was a projection lamp, and then it went out to travel down all of these fiber optics to different pinpoints on the ship.
There was a tungsten halogen bulbs that were inside the ship, which are very hot and require cooling, and there was a compressed air system to cool those off. It was like a little miniature nuclear reactor out there on the stage.
We tried to transmit scale to people on all the ships. It's like big ships have hundreds of thousands of lights, little ships have 1 or 2 or 3 or 5, you know. So right from the beginning you'd say, this is really a big ship because it has lots of lights on it. with Darth Vader's Star Destroyer, the original idea was to save money, was to just take the regular white Star Destroyer and paint it blue. Well, from a model maker's point of view, the problem with that is it had tens of thousands of little fiber optics that we would have to scrape to get the lights exposed. And also we knew that, just because they tell you that they're through shooting the white Star Destroyer, it doesn't mean they really are. So on one side there was production, said we want to keep the budget low. On the other side there was the model shop that knew that that wouldn't save time, which would then affect the budget. So we appealed to them to make it a totally different ship. And that's when Joe Johnston started drawing that really long, narrow arrow is really what it looks like. George really liked the idea, that it really looked different. And probably the only problem is that then production said, but it has to be done in 7 weeks because we shoot in 7 weeks. Yes, we were going to make this whole new Darth Vader ship, which was called eventually the Executor, but to make it be really huge, we needed to have more lights. So if the 8-foot white Star Destroyer had about 100,000 lights, Darth Vader's ship then, since it was so much bigger, had to have many more lights. We couldn't use fiber optics because we were already reaching the max at around 100,000 fiber optics, and you can only fit, your human hands can only do so many little things in the period of time we had. So what we did was, I think it was Paul Houston came up with the idea of doing artwork and then etching into brass these little tiny holes. And so we could draw up one panel, like something like this, reduce it down, count how many lights would be per inch, and we eventually came up with around 250,000 lights. So you just knew that, this is really, really big. Both with that ship and the white Star Destroyer, it became like a quilting bee. So they were big, and people would sit around and they'd work on this section. And then I'd say every 4 hours or something, I'd say, well, move 2 feet, and have somebody else rotate so that you wouldn't get one person's style that would dominate only in one area, and then somebody else's style that would develop in another area. But we worked 7 days a week for about 7 weeks to do that. Me and Paul, our eyes were, by the time 7 weeks happened, our eyes were just like hanging down like this and pallid, gray pallor, and we took off to Mexico for a week right away.
Empire was originally released in 70 millimeter. And after seeing it a few times, George decided that the ending wasn't real clear. So he asked us to build a new, larger scale section of the medical frigate. We re-shot that sequence when the film was eventually released in 35 millimeter. Apparently nobody knew that it had a new ending. It was really different from the first one. It explained the relationship between the Falcon and the frigate. With all those models, George wanted everything to look aged. That, you know, this was a rebel group, not the Empire, so they didn't have brand new equipment. So everything was scavenged from junkyards and made to work. So we did essentially the same thing. We did miniature bits and pieces, you know, found objects like the model kits. The saving grace for all those models is that really trick paint job that Joe developed for us. Essentially dirty white with a lot of stains and bullet hits and that sort of thing. And it would have had fiber optic lighting tricks in it and a rear projection screen for the little window where our heroes are standing. Time was the big challenge. Everything was in a hurry, so we were working between 10 and 18-hour days, and in the case of the second frigate, it was 24 hours a day for, I believe it was 2 days. And then George said, he did that so quickly, why did it take so long to do the rest of them?
The Cloud cars, two of them intercept the Falcon as it's approaching Cloud City, and that's when we first see them, and then we notice that there's two pilots separated by the engine.
It's fairly sleek and doesn't have as much the mechanical detail that a lot of the other ships had, and I guess that's the aesthetic of the Cloud City, is that it's more Art Deco and more refined. This model was also inspired a little bit by John Giroux and Mobius and his kind of whimsical sense of vehicles in a science fiction setting. It was also one of the, in Empire Strikes Back, getting more into forms that are curved and have compound curves rather than the flat shapes of Episode 4.
I did a lot of surface detailing and painting of it. It was a orange paint job. That's what they wanted, so kind of distinctive in a blue sky. We'd give it little details here and there to show scale. That was always an important thing to include in a model, particularly next to a human. You could always figure out how big it was based on what a human looked like next to it.
The difficult thing about the Cloud car was that at that time and that kind of technology, and not making molds and casting parts, but just using vacuum formed plastic parts, that it was a little bit tricky to make the seam in the center of it line up and not be visually too powerful.
And of course, you never know what these things sound like till Ben Burtt puts his sound magic to it, and it's pretty neat.
Permission granted to land on platform 327.
Thank you.
I don't even think I saw the drawings for Cloud City till we were already well into Empire. Then it was brought up. Joe Johnston was like, "Well, we got to do this. We got to do this kind of a model." And at the time, I had interviewed lots of different model makers. I was interviewing, sometimes 1 and 2 a day, kind of thing, trying to find people. It was hard to find sometimes. There was this one sculptor that I had interviewed, and models that he actually did as sculptures looked very much like Cloud City. And so I thought, oh, wow, perfect this would be. The guy was named Mark Thorpe. He had his sculptures that he would bring in and show us, and everybody went, oh, yeah, I could make one like this. I'll make one that's a little bit different. I'll make one like this. And some was like a quilting bee. We sent people to their desk all to build kind of a similar theme model, but each one would be different. But then they were all brought together and put on tables and shot that way.